Today we've got one of the best classical guitarists in the world today, Grammy Award winner Jason Vieaux. He has performed as a concert soloist with over 100 orchestras. Vieaux has taught at the Cleveland Institute of Music since 1997, heading the guitar department since 2001. He has received a Naumburg Foundation Top Prize, a Cleveland Institute of Music Distinguished Alumni Award, the Guitar Foundation of America International Guitar Competition First Prize, and a Salon de Virtuosi Career Grant. Vieaux was the first classical musician to be featured on NPR's Tiny Desk series. In 2012, the Jason Vieaux School of Classical Guitar was launched with ArtistWorks Incorporated, an interface that provides one-on-one online study with Vieaux for guitar students around the world. In 2015, Vieaux won the Grammy for Best Classical Instrumental Solo for his album Play. Now, Pat Metheny has composed a 4-movement suite for Vieaux, which will be premiered later this year. And finally, Jason is in the midst of recording a new Bach album on Azika Records. All of that and more we will discuss shortly. But first, Jason, great to have you on the show for the first time.
Well, thank you, Nick. Thanks for having me on.
Well, you've said that you started playing the guitar at the young age of 5 and began classical guitar lessons at 8. Is that right?
Yes, my mother bought me a guitar when I was 5. I'm not sure how much playing I did on it. I probably just goofed around on it now and then. And I took some music reading lessons when I was 6 or 7 in Buffalo from a jazz guitarist named Joel Perry. And he basically we were using our guitars. He was using our guitars to as a vehicle to teach solfege, basically, and kind of, sort of the basic building blocks of music. Not so much learning things to play, more like music training lessons. And then the Buffalo Guitar Quartet came to my school, my elementary school, when I was 7, and right around my 8th birthday, I started with Jeremy Sparks with classical guitar lessons.
Let me ask you something. Is your family a musical family? I mean, did your father or mother, do they play instruments themselves?
Well, as far as my background, I mean, it's we really have no connection to music or entertainment or the arts. In fact, my family history in Buffalo is, quite, very much centered around blue collar lifestyle and work. And factories and Laker boats and this kind of thing, Buffalo, like Cleveland or Erie or Detroit, right? Those towns on the Great Lakes. There was a very thriving industry, 2 and 3 generations ago of Laker boats that would transport goods along the Great Lakes. And so my father's side, there's a long, as I like to say in interviews, a long line of coal passers. So my background really wasn't so much, it hadn't had anything kind of connection to the arts or music. And however, my father's side of the family in particular, I think that over the years I've learned that they were extremely musical, like being able to play instruments by ear. I always knew that my father had a really very strong ear and a love for music. When I started playing classical guitar, he immediately became a fan of classical music on the radio and listening to WNED in Buffalo. And when I was in college, I realized as my ear training at Cleveland Institute of Music was developing, that he would pick out sort of ancillary lines in orchestral music and even be able to identify the instrument that was playing it. So, I mean, that's not something that everybody can do. And like I said, my father would have had absolutely zero training or practice on any kind of musical instrument. So I think it probably comes something from there as far as kind of an aptitude for music.
Now, let me ask you a quick question. Do you have perfect pitch?
I do. But I think really perfect pitch is a kind of a buzzword in culture that where but and in fact, it doesn't really, having perfect pitch, as we've noticed in conservatory training, does not necessarily help one identify intervals or chord progressions, or the thing does not actually help all that much all the time, depending on the person, with the identification of and the analysis of how music is put together, which in music theory is very important in order to become a complete musician. Actually, having relative pitch, or the ability to measure distances, is a much more important skill than perfect pitch. But yes, I realized in high school that it's very easy for me to hear A440 in my ear. And I noticed also in high school that I could pick out harmonies and even dense harmonies, like singing groups like Take Six, or this kind of thing. Very complex jazz harmonies when I was in high school.
You mentioned that you did solfege training. Now, were you doing fixed do, or was that movable-do?
Oh, that's fixed do at Cleveland Institute of Music. Yeah, some places they have movable do.
Oh, no, I mean, remember you said you had a jazz guitar teacher who was doing solfege training with you as your first...
Yeah, that was like when I was like 6 years old. That was basically like being able to read and write. Like, my mother still has the notebooks, like when I'm of my 6-year-old scrawling like a C major scale on a staff and writing the words do, re, mi, fa, sol. I mean, I didn't really even know what that was, but I mean, it was basically like a very beginning of solfege training, and then I did learn to play these notes on the guitar, but that was the extent of my guitar playing at that point. It was probably more, and then in elementary school, I was in a recorder group, playing recorder, and also in chorus, all the way through high school. And so my reading actually also in the public school systems was strengthened by singing.
Did you play any other instruments growing up? Was there a piano in your house? You mentioned the recorder. Was there other instruments you dabbled with?
At some point when I was in middle school or high school, my mother had found a very cheap old piano that she put in the living room, with the intent of having the three of us kids, my older brother and younger sister and I, to take piano lessons on, which I enjoyed and did well, but my brother and sister didn't really enjoy taking lessons too much on it. So I took a little bit of piano there, and then of course at Cleveland Institute of Music, in order to graduate with your bachelor's degree, you have to pass 2 years. You have to take 2 years of piano and pass a certain level of proficiency. So other than that, I mean, at that point I was so deep into classical guitar that I really only practiced piano in order to just barely make the cut and get through the proficiency in order to graduate.
Now, you mentioned in another interview that you've listened to an incredible amount of music growing up. Let me read you a quote that you gave. Musically, I'd say that my first musical exposure was to the Beatles, Seals and Crofts, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Supertramp, and a whole lot of soul and R&B from the 60s, as well as modern jazz. That was when I was 3 years old and a bit after, my parents' vinyl, basically. Can you describe the music that you listened to, the amount of records, and what really resonated with you from a young age?
That statement is 100% accurate. I was at when I was 3 years old, and I would have, of course, been playing, and with my brother and sister at home. My brother at that point would already been in first grade, but my favorite activity to do was to kind of sit in my room that I share with my brother and play with my light bright and put one record on after the other. And my mother, noticing this, then just went into her closet or the attic and got all of her records out and sort of put them in front of me, and which was great. It was like, for me, it was like having Christmas every time she brought down new records, and I would put these on. So yeah, my earliest two musical memories are the 45 singles of Proud Mary and Born on the Bayou by Creedence Clearwater Revival, and the Stevie Wonder single not I Was Made to Love Her, although I was listening to that later, a little bit later. For Once in My Life. That's a very, and Aretha Franklin, Respect. Those three records are very early, probably my earliest memories. And then the vinyl, the LPs that my mother brought down were the Beatles, and then I kind of went crazy over that. I mean, I used to tell my uncles and aunts, and at 4 and 5, that I just talk about the Beatles, and in my mind they were still together at that time, even though it was 1978, 79.
I guess would it be fair to say that your first proper classical guitar teacher was Jeremy Sparks of the Buffalo Guitar Quartet?
Yeah, I would definitely say that was. I mean, now Joel Perry gave me some basics on left hand shaping and this kind of thing, and how to hold down a note and that sort of thing. But my first actual real training, weekly training on the guitar, a sustained weekly lesson with very clear goals, was with Jeremy Sparks, and I studied with him all the way from when I started with him, which was probably like a day after my 8th birthday, until I graduated from high school at 16. And he was a very good foundation for me, it turned out. As a teacher now, it's having taught now for so long, sort of the older you get, the more you realize how important having a foundation like that was, and how lucky I was to have, to be studying with someone like that. I mean, I think sometimes people take that kind of thing for granted, because they think, like, is in your kid mind or your teenage mind, you think, well, everybody has access to something like that, and then of course you get out into the world, and you fly 2 million miles around the world, and you realize it's not really the case. So it was my mother was very proactive about my music, my musical development.
Now, let me read to you what you said. You said, "It wasn't until my classical guitar teacher, Jeremy Sparks, started training me at 8 years old that I began to learn the language, not just the technique of playing and listening to classical music." Could you elaborate on that statement?
Well, basically, what that statement implies is that we didn't have classical music records in the house when I was 7 and 8 years old, and that's basically true. There was a Leonard Bernstein New York Philharmonic recording of An American in Paris and Rhapsody in Blue, and that was basically it. I mean, we didn't, because my dad was, before that, such a huge modern jazz fanatic. My dad, the only pop music my father enjoyed listening to was like Seals and Crofts, because he liked the harmonization of the two voices, and that kind of thing. So he could appreciate basically folk singers or singer-songwriters, that kind of thing. But he was mainly a kind of an anti-pop music kind of an attitude. He really was. I mean, he was very
and are you talking about contemporary pop of the time? Because the Beatles was
the time, yeah, contemporary pop of the time. Like, he even kind of poo-pooed the Beatles. Like, he kind of, I mean, he was like, well, I remember asking him about him, like, in disbelief. I was like, in high school I had played, Sgt. Pepper or the White Album. I was like, Dad, you didn't dig this stuff when you were when this stuff was coming? He's like, well, yeah, the later stuff was pretty good. But he almost had this kind of sort of staunch anti-rock music attitude. So wait, going back to my state, now what you're saying, going back to so really it was, you realize later on that I was learning about the language of classical music through the repertoire, through, studying, doing studies by Fernando Sor or Mauro Giuliani. Fernando Sor studies were some of my earlier repertoire and Renaissance stuff. Jeremy Sparks, my first teacher, was very much into Renaissance era music and early Baroque and things like that. So some of those easier pieces that you could, I could handle at age, 9 and 10, I would do. And I remember studying classical gas too. I remember my teacher would write these things out all by ear from the record, and he'd transcribe them from ear from the record, so that we didn't have to buy the sheet music, because there wasn't a lot of money in the household. Let's put it that way.
Now, it appears to me that a lot of your interest was very self-directed. Did your parents ever get on your case to practice, or was it always for you just a pleasure for you to do?
Well, my parents, my father loves to tell this story about. I've heard him tell lots of other, classical guitar parents and this kind of thing, because, of course, at these, if I would play a concert with where they were at, there would always be a lot of, people that would like to pick their brain about, what it was like. And he said, he would tell them the story. He said, oh yeah, he'd say, oh, we'd be at my mother's house, basically my grandmother's or my aunt's house. He said, we'd be at, family member's house for a holiday, for Christmas or something, and he would come up to me and Jason would come up to me and say, oh, Dad, I only got 1 hour of practice in today. Are we going to, what time do you think we're going to get home?
And see where this is going.
Like I had this kind of internal pressure on myself, at age 11, 12, 13, 14. Because, a lot of that was probably more of an awareness of the time crunch, in the sense that there was a looming, performance date, and I had to get, such and such, amount of pieces together. I think it probably came from that, which, I'm basically the same way today. Obviously, the volume is, pretty heavy. But even in those days, if there was a date, I think I had a very good sort of sense of time organization, and I knew that I only had this amount of stuff to do, and I wanted to, make hay while the sun was, still shining, as they say.
Now, what age were you when you started to listen to records of John Williams, the classical guitarist, David Russell, and Julian Bream?
Yeah, those guys, and Christopher Parkening, Andres Segovia, the usual suspects as well. That was something around. I would say I was 9. I want to say 9 or 10, and my Spanish teacher in my school gave me a copy as a present. I think he was retiring, and he loved the fact that I was studying classical guitar. And I could play some simple pieces and this sort of thing by the time I was 9 or 10. I remember coming to school. My mother was the secretary, at that school. That's how, we ran into Jeremy Sparks there, because they did an outreach program there. But I remember going in and kind of playing for the librarian, and his name was Cobos, and the Spanish teacher, and he gave me this cassette tape of John Williams, and that was the first recording that we'd had. And then from there, Jeremy Sparks, my teacher, was then going to, again, because we just didn't have the money to buy records. There was really no disposable income in our household. So Jeremy would go to the Buffalo Public Library system, and in those days you could take out all these vinyl LPs, and so he'd bring a small stack of LPs over, and I'd start listening to those. And also, I used to, in those days, like you did on the radio, if you had a boom box or a kind of a stereo system where you could record cassette tapes off of the turntable, I was basically making cassette tapes off of those LPs as well. So I had after a few years, I had a pretty good cross section of commercial classical LPs by all of those players, for sure.
Later in your education, you studied with John Holmquist at the Cleveland Institute of Music for your Bachelor's of Music. Speaking about him, you've said, I learned a great deal about music from John Holmquist, whom I consider to be one of the finest musicians to ever play our instrument. Now, can you describe your experience studying with him after Jeremy Sparks, and what was the difference, and what were the new things you were learning?
I think for me it was kind of a thing, again, in hindsight, I couldn't see it at the time, but I needed to move on from Jeremy because I had studied with him for so long, for 8 or 9 years, that it was really time to move on to somebody that was basically performing at a very high level, and had performed at the highest level. So while Jeremy was a fantastic player, he was not a solo soloist, a solo guitarist. He was a member of a quartet, and he tended to choose the parts for himself that were more like the bass line. You know, he was kind of like the bass player of that group. And with John, that was my first. Well, that wasn't my first contact with a great virtuoso. I mean, for me, having master classes with David Russell at age 11, 13, and 15. I mean, David Russell really became a huge primary influence on me, and sort of an iconic figure right away. But then to have the weekly lessons to go to get into a top music school like Cleveland Institute of Music and be studying week after week with John was another thing entirely. I mean, that was kind of something where someone would actually demonstrate the things to you and be playing it much better than you, and with a beautiful sound and tone and execution and musical ideas and phrasing. And so a lot of things about technique, a lot of things about musicianship and phrasing and architecture of a piece of music, like an architecture of a sonata form. And then also a lot of body, like muscle awareness, joint awareness, breathing exercises. Like he studied Tai Chi and he was into Sufi poetry, and he was very much like, he was very much of his time in that sense in the early 90s, late 80s, the kind of new age movement of really where Americans were really first getting into a lot of Eastern cultures and sort of health and wellness practices, and John was really right in there, and this stuff was being shown to us and practiced in our seminar classes, and so that was a mind-blowing thing because like for me at 17 years old as a freshman at Cleveland Institute of Music, like I had never even seen or heard of anything of things like that, like a Sufi breathing exercise, or a body trip or something like that, or meditation, meditation exercises and that kind of thing. So all of that, body awareness stuff was also just, really influential on me. It's things that I use to this day and teach others, my students to this day.
Where were you at 17 years old, playing-wise? If you could describe yourself back then, did you consider yourself kind of like a young, full of fire, up-and-coming kind of hotshot? And did you have a lot of... you mentioned...
I think in those days, definitely, yeah. Yeah, go ahead. You said I mentioned something earlier.
You mentioned... No, this is also slightly related. You mentioned in high school you were kind of a music snob. And did that translate to your attitude as a player? Did you really want to be a great player at 17? And did you have that really competitive
No, I
fire?
wanted to be a great... I wanted to be a great player at age 12. David Russell will tell you that the great Scottish guitarist and Grammy winner, he remembers all of those master classes when I was 13. He said I just had this kind of look in my eye when I looked back at him when he was showing me something that almost like, I'm going to do this. Like, I'm going to take this information that you're giving me and I'm going to apply it because I very much wanted to be a great player someday. And so, and also, you have to, my first public recital, full-length recital, was age 12 in Buffalo. And from that point until I graduated high school at 16, I had logged in, a pretty good amount of public performance in Rochester, Buffalo, and surrounding areas, and played in a lot of master classes, and a lot of live radio programs, like live, things. So those are really good, things that's a lot of very good live playing experience. So when I was 19 in the GFA, when I won the GFA International Competition, which is kind of like our Van Cliburn, if you will, I had a lot of public performance under my belt, so it wasn't unusual for me at all to perform for an hour. So actually, the final round of the GFA felt easier to me than the previous rounds because then you could perform for an entire half an hour. Which was that was actually more my wheelhouse by that point at 19. So yeah, at 17, when I got accepted into Cleveland Institute of Music, I think Jeremy had typed out a list of my repertoire, and it was about 75 pieces by that point.
You mentioned the GFA, so just for my audience, that's the Guitar Foundation of America. And so you were 1992, and actually there's a terrifying story that you mentioned before on another show about breaking a string in the middle of the finals performance. Could you retell that story?
Oh, yeah. That was the thing. I think, in the world of classical guitar, it's this kind of story of lore. I think it seems because it must be because I'm reminded of it. I've been reminded of it for 25 years. It was I was in the final round, and I was changing my strings like every couple days. That was more or less like the kind of I probably didn't need to, but it was a kind of I was just I was really changing strings a lot during those 2 weeks to always have like a fresh set of basses on while I practiced. Leading up to the competition, and what had happened was I was on my last pack of strings without realizing it. I had actually burned through all of my basses, and so in the final round, what I didn't realize was I didn't have a backup set of strings. I didn't even know back then that you should save one set of old strings and keep it in your guitar case. I didn't, this was not something I had ever really needed to encounter before. So, ironically, I was playing a very big guitar then, an old Ramirez concert model that in those days, those concert models from the 60s and 70s that Segovia played were an extra long scale, an extra long string length. And I had this set on, and I don't know how long I would have had it on, but the fifth string broke, which is unusual because it's usually the fourth string is the thinnest wound bass string. But in this case, the fifth one broke as I was kind of stretching it, I would sort of give the string a little bit of a tug when you would tune strings down to scordatura, which is an Italian, we use the Italian word scordatura, which means to detune, or, so it's kind of, you're changing the pitch of of a string from one pitch to another. A lot of guitar players call it drop D, right? And so the drop D tuning, changes the overall tuning of the instrument, and then you've got to really tune all six strings to D major. So I was doing that and tugging on the fifth string, and I started playing, and it broke while I was playing. So I had just two short movements left in my final round, and it turns out that I had enough time. Like the whole auditorium gasped. I mean, there was this huge, audible, like the wind, like the air got sucked out of the auditorium. And
it's quite unusual to have a classical guitar string snap. I mean, they last so much longer than the steel strings. Were you wailing away on those?
Because you're not bending them, right? Yeah. Well, I mean, I hit the last chord of the Ponce Sonata that I was playing on the first movement is, has a big raschiato at the end, and I'm sure I hit it with a lot of force, but nothing that nothing that, again, like you're saying, nothing that should really break the string. But it turns out that I had enough time, so I went off stage. They said, I heard this voice from the darkness of the auditorium that said, Jason, you have enough time to go back and change your string and come back and finish as much of your final round as you can. So I went back to my case, and I didn't have a string. So then I wasn't actually before that moment when the string broke. I mean, I was probably so stunned that it happened that I didn't know. I really wasn't. I was really just more of like an attitude of like, okay, well, on to the next thing, or, well, here you are. And then they said, well, you have enough time to go back, and so that was great. That felt like another chance. And when I went back and discovered there was no string, the competitor who was after me, who's one of my best friends in the guitar world today, Andrew Zone, great player, great teacher. he lent a fifth string to me, and there was an assistant backstage, and he strung it up really quickly, and I went out, and I was, played the other two movements, tuning the string as I played, because, of course, as you can imagine, it would slip.
Oh, no.
It was slipping downward, because it had just been put on.
Yeah.
And played the rest of the performance, and, the thing was, it was like, that was already, all the way through, that was a good performance for me. You know how, sports athletes, and they'd say, I was definitely on my A game. Well, all the way up through that point, I was probably playing as well as I could possibly play at that point. So, I think I was putting together a good round, and then continued that on after putting the string on. So I think that maybe in some respect that I don't know you'd have to talk to the judges or find out who they were to see what their impressions of it were. But it seemed that I think maybe what it sort of looked like from the outside was, wow, this guy's not fazed, really not fazed by anything. And in fact, there was a lot of why I was reminded about it for years after that was some people actually asked me if I had planned it, if it was actually something that I had done because they had heard either from their teacher or they were there, and they said, you seemed so calm about the whole thing. It seemed like you were too calm. You didn't even react. You went back, put on the string. We could hear that it was slipping.
Yep.
Or and that you there was no. It didn't show on your face that you were the least bit bothered by it. So, again, I had so much performance experience by that point. I think that's what was really working for me. I remember playing for my teacher in Buffalo. I remember playing for his studio class during a really cold Buffalo night, and they were having seminar class. And so he wanted to bring me in because, by that age, like at 13, 14, I was already playing, some pretty advanced pieces. And I remember playing something on my, $300 guitar, and one of the strings going boom like that, it just slackened,
yep.
It just
yep.
loosened. And I remember even at that time, I remember that moment and just not stopping, just immediately grabbing the string. I stopped obviously the piece, performing the piece for a second, but immediately just tuning the string back up and then continuing playing as soon as possible, like the show must go on type of thing. I think that. So I
that
think
almost
that
adds to the show.
Yeah, well, you certainly don't want something like that to happen, but I think even from an early age, from 12, 13, 14, it was very much like, I was a very focused performer in that sense. It was very much about the show must go on type of attitude.
Let's move on to a particularly interesting physical thing that is very cool that people notice about you is that you use ping pong ball shards for artificial fingernails. So you would take a shard from a ping pong ball and you would attach it with crazy glue to your fingers. Is it all your fingers or just your thumb?
Oh, no, it's just my thumb. The only time I've ever used one on one of my fingers was, I think maybe I had to do this one time in 25 years where I broke my nail. My nails actually don't break very easily, and I use it on my thumbnail, and my thumbnail doesn't break very easily either. However, my thumbnail, I can't grow. There's a certain length of each of a guitarist's right hand nails. So the right hand is what plucks the string, right? And not only is it your sound, it's not these four plectrums on the string. It also is your golf swing, as I like to call it. It very much is a mechanic that if one nail is not at its optimum length, it can really feel as though, especially at an advanced playing level, it can really feel like you're playing with a different set of golf clubs, like all of a sudden in a tournament. Like it can feel very much like your whole right hand is off or thrown off balance. And so what I discovered in my early 20s was that having a longer thumbnail just immediately corrected and made much easier for me a lot of technical lot of technical things, a lot of mechanical things in terms of speed playing, particularly in arpeggios. But my thumbnail grows out of my thumb in such a way that it corkscrews right away. Like it's a very heavy kind of dip on the side. So I could never get the length of it beyond the end of my thumb. And so the ping pong ball was a way to, so like you would use a ping pong ball. The ping pong ball is, you cut it into like a crescent moon shape, right? And that's the most common substitute for any classical guitarist. I mean, most classical guitarists that are professionals, that any guitarist that has a high volume of performance to do during the course of a calendar year, most likely is going to have, a half of a ping pong ball or a few pieces of it in their guitar case.
That's interesting.
Just in case they smash their nail on the way to the concert hall. Like you have to have something to, just the same way you would have an extra pack of strings if you broke a string on stage. You have to have something so that the show goes on, So for me, it's more of like a professional necessity just due to the volume of concerts and rehearsals and practice hours that I have to put in, over the last 25 years since I became a full-fledged professional.
What I really admire about you, Jason, is you have this really thorough understanding of music. You approach music like a musician, and I know that sounds ridiculous to say, but I notice a lot of, especially the classically trained ones, they tend to just read notes and focus on note-perfect perfection. But you really look at harmony and theory. Let me read this quote that you said. "Between my theory training at the Cleveland Institute of Music and all the jazz I was listening to and playing, I could really get into an avant-garde post-punk group like Shudder to Think and have fun analyzing the chord clusters they were using. I was a total music nerd by that point, still am." So what's
cool.
Your understanding
I like that quote.
Your understanding of theory, how does that inform your musicianship? Do you look beyond the notes just for the execution of it? Do you look at the harmony? Do you look at the melody and how they interact with each other? How does music theory, how is that important to you?
Well, you're looking at all of it all the time. I mean, that's the thing that's the important thing that I have to impart to guitar students. A lot of times you have to, the ones you have to really, really pound home this point with are the most advanced players. Because oftentimes the most advanced players that are in your studio are trying to win competitions. And when you're trying to win a competition, you tend to, in terms of what your focus is, you tend to block out anything other than the notes, than getting the notes without buzzing and playing a competition round with as few mistakes as possible. But when you're circling the wagons like that and not, and it's almost like a kind of a study, a kind of a practicing out of desperation, and so almost like an austerity where it's like, well, no, we don't have time to do this other stuff, right? So if you're always entering competitions, which I was never in that kind of mold anyway, if you're always entering competitions, the tendency is when you're studying a piece of music or you're working on it, to not use that practice time to think about your theory training and what you're studying about, harmony and melody, and form and structure, the architecture of a piece and this kind of thing, and to just get to the business every day of playing cleanly. But the problem is if that theory is not in your playing and your ear is not well trained and you don't develop a culture, a lifestyle, if you will, of looking at that and having an awareness of it with every piece that you study, it shows up in your playing. So you can play a perfect round with, note perfect round that really is devoid of musical nutrients, if you will. It's almost like if you take broccoli and you just steam all the, you steam it too long, right? Like you steam all the nutrients out of it, or you boil it, or something like that. Or it's like it doesn't have enough of the nutrients or the information in the performance. And so, that was something that, again, John Holmquist was very high on that kind of stuff and knew, and basically knew everything about how music was put together. It takes a long time to study, and then again, your practice. I have a very sort of. It's not a methodology because I modify it according to every student, but I really try to encourage them to take their time in the beginning, the initial 1 or 2 months of studying a piece, so that they can absorb as many of those nutrients while they're actually practicing the physicality of the piece, to go ahead and stir all of those things in at once if they can, and just take their time. Because the more that stuff you invest in, in the beginning of it, the more it will be in your playing when you're done, when it's polished, when you've spent all the physical hours on polishing the passage work and all that stuff. So you're right. It's a lot of classical musicians. It ends up sounding a little bit like an athletic event, like an athletic, which it is. It is extremely difficult. I think a lot of the general population does not understand how extremely difficult it is to give a clean performance of a classical piece of music on any instrument. It requires hours and hours and hours. I've probably put in somewhere between 25 and 30,000 hours of practice in, and some of my students at Curtis and CIM are well past their 10,000 hours. If we think about the outliers theory, they're well past that. They're already on pace they're almost pushing 20,000 hours at this point, and they're like in their late teens, early 20s. So. So using those hours wisely is what's going to allow them, in my opinion, to actually have a career beyond the competition phase, to where you're going to be able to collaborate with other artists and be able to play chamber music, and you're not going to have to stop to think and spend extra hours on thinking about or worrying about, what is the music supposed to sound like or how to interpret it. That's a lot of students that want to study with me. They say, well, I can play the pieces I want to play, but I don't know how to interpret them. And that usually, upon a further investigation, means that for whatever reason, there just hasn't been enough hours invested in the music side of their study.
I want you to react to a quote that I found very interesting in doing research by John Williams, the guitarist. He said, "Students are preoccupied with fingerings and not notes, much less sounds. Some are able to play difficult solo works from memory, but have a very poor sense of ensemble playing or timing."
Right.
And he said instead of playing difficult pieces, he would say play easier Haydn string quartets. Yeah. And would you react to that?
Oh, he's absolutely 100% correct in my opinion. I've read that quote, and I've referenced that quote much to the chagrin of many students. That is not a popular set of quotes there by John Williams to digest, from a lot of guitarists, because to them it feels like a race. That to them it feels like like they're running a race against all these other young guitarists around the world to capture the most prizes. And while that is also important, what he's talking about is like that when they get out of school, when they're done with their bachelor's degree or their master's degree, he's saying that what he's suggesting is a lot of them are not able to function at a high level, at the same level as their peers in the string and wind, brass, and so on and so forth, as their other counterparts or their other peers in classical music. Now there's a bit of an advantage, of course, that let's say a string player, a cellist has, is they're often, if they're very serious about classical music, they're often in a youth orchestra. They're, in other words, if you're a string player, you're going to be playing a lot of chamber music from the moment that you start playing. It's just part of the training, and so that's stuff that to them is like they can't separate the act of playing ensemble from playing their instrument. It's like it's just part of the deal. And I credit again, my first teacher, Jeremy Sparks, I credit him a lot for this, because all alongside the studies of the etudes and practicing scales and arpeggios, which he made me, demonstrate for him weekly, and the concert pieces that I wanted to study and play, right? That was my primary, goal, was to play concert pieces, was playing duos with him, because he probably realized I didn't have an outlet for that sort of thing. And I was probably one of the only classical musicians, in my neighborhood, if not the only kid studying classical music in my neighborhood. And so, it's that he regularly, I played lots of duos with him in lessons, and that was basically a chamber music training right from the start of my classical guitar training. So yeah, that quote by John Williams is absolutely spot on. I've read that many times. Yeah, he was absolutely, I think, someone like John Williams, from his more lofty perch at the time. He was really at the very top of the, of the whole thing in classical guitar for many years. So I think when he was visiting, when he would do the occasional master class, I think he was a bit surprised, actually. I won't speak for him. I mean, you'd have to ask John. You'd have to ask Mr. Williams, but I think he was probably a little bit shocked at the lack of musicianship in the playing.
This is a good segue now to talk about your arranging for the guitar, because you're known as a great interpreter, but you also make some very tasteful arrangements, such as In a Sentimental Mood on your album Play, or Isaac Albanese's suite Espanola. What is your approach to arranging music for the guitar?
I don't really have an approach. I just, something kind of catches my ear, a lot of it is just through professional situations where, like the Ellington arrangement of In a Sentimental Mood was actually born out of a symphony engagement where I was playing the Rodrigo Concerto, for the 100th time, but that particular symphony, it was in Charlotte. It was Charlotte Symphony, in North Carolina. They had the program was bookended by American composers, by Bernstein. Was the first piece, and then they did the Rodrigo Concerto, which is a Spanish piece, of course. And then at the end, they had something by Gershwin. So they wanted me in the second half to play like a few solo pieces while being interviewed by the conductor on stage, which, this was back in 2007, 2008, which is like, now all these conductors are speaking from the stage. But back then, this is a pretty cool idea, I think, in hindsight. He would interview me, and then in my solo pieces, we were to get the audience from Spain back to America, with these solo guitar pieces. So I played Sevilla by Albanese, right? And then I needed something Spanish or Latin American. Latin American music is a lot, South American music is a lot easier to make the transition into jazz because of Brazilian music, right? Because of the jazz harmonies that are in Brazilian popular music and classical music as well. So I played a Jorge Morel piece, and then I thought, okay, well, there's another connector, and I probably had another connection piece in between Spain and South America. And then from Morel, I could get back to America. I could get back to Gershwin through like doing an arrangement of a jazz standard. So that was really what it was, and I probably put that arrangement together in about a half an hour. And then spent, just the bare bones of it, and probably spent another half an hour sort of working out a little bit of the inner voice details or any little fills or whatever that I was doing, little piano fills or saxophone fills or something meaning like something you would imitate on the guitar, bebop licks and stuff like that.
Oh, it would take a whole other interview, I think, to really get into that. I really wish we had more time, but I definitely encourage my listeners to go check out all your works, especially that in a Sentimental Mood. I mean, what an arrangement! So beautiful on your album Play.
You.
Time is running out, so I have just a few quick questions to ask you. The one is, I want to get your opinion on improvisation, because you do it. You're a very unusual classical guitarist, but you're really such a full-blooded everything musician. You seem to do it all. Classical guitarists are not known for improvisation, but you do improvise, right? It's something that you can do.
Oh yeah, I love, like, you know, I mean, this is one of many examples. But it just kind of popped into my head. I had a master's student in the late '90s, Dan Lapel. He's a very successful classical guitarist, the avant-garde, you know, new music guitarist in New York City. When he was studying with me, he would come over. I mean, we were roughly the same age. That was back in the time when I was like studying. I was teaching students. I was teaching at CIM from 1997 on. And a lot of times, initially, those first few years, I was teaching students who were older than me, which was very odd for me. But you know, but Dan and I were roughly the same age, and he would come over, and we'd hang out, and we'd make up a chord progression. We just kind of set out like flamenco sketches off of Kind of Blue or whatever. We just put together like seven or eight chords, loop it around, and we'd take solos over it, or we'd just read charts together. And I learned a lot of improvising actually from Dan Lapel, and I'd pick up stuff along the way. And in those days, I actually got to a fairly professional level of what Pat Metheny would call, you know, functioning on the bandstand, meaning like I could actually bring my guitar and my reel book and open it up, and someone could call a tune I'd never seen before, and I got to the point where I could, you know, comp the chords underneath the soloists, and then if the leader pointed to me to take a solo, I could even, in some cases, if I felt comfortable. So, a lot of times I would shake them off. I would shake the leader off. I'm like, no, like, you know, you do it. It's all by eye contact and body language. And you could shake the leader off and say, no, I don't want to take a solo over this. But I got, you know what I mean? Like, I got to that kind of thing. That's what functioning on the bandstand is sort of like you get to that thing. But no, it's very healthy actually for your ear. The benefits from it, if one can, you know, if one is if a classical guitarist is so inclined, it does tremendous things for your ear. And also your knowledge of the fretboard. Your knowledge of the fretboard goes into another dimension when you have to actually figure out how to play new melodies over a chord progression. And of course, it ties all of your theory and ear training into one kind of thing as well. The jazz musicians are really, in some ways, the best musicians, Western musicians, because you can't play a single note without knowing the entire structure of the tune and how all those musical atoms and molecules are put together.
There's a very interesting trend now. The field of classical improvisation is starting to get a lot of interest. And what is your take on classical improvisation or improvisation within the field of classical music? And I'm talking specifically about styles such as the Baroque. We knew Bach was a famous improviser, yeah. So was Clementi. What is your opinion?
Mozart too,
exactly.
I'm sure.
What's your take on this trend, this resurgence?
Well, I mean, it's really been happening in classical music within sort of the established classical eras of Baroque playing for a long time, and many famous pianists have been either writing their own cadenzas or improvising their own cadenzas on the classical era repertoire, such as, say, like a Mozart piano concerto. So that's been alive and well, I think, for a long time. It's just that when I was a student, the difference now is when I was a student in the conservatory in the early 90s, if a pianist came into Cleveland Orchestra and played their own cadenza of a Mozart concerto instead of playing Mozart's cadenza, it was quite a bit of news, right? In the early 90s, late 80s, that was something that was really something kind of special. Now it's kind of, if someone would do that, I don't think anyone would really blink an eye. I mean, because also it's not that important whether they do it or not. I think it's also part of the thing because of the internet. Once the late '90s came around with the internet, and then and how that really changed the world in so many profound ways, much the same way that the Industrial Revolution changed the world 100 years prior. Or so. I think the internet really. Over time, over a couple generations of people, changed a lot of attitudes about classical music. And it just seems silly for it to be sort of viewed as this kind of stodgy thing that you only play, like this kind of thing. So improvising your own cadenza or writing your own cadenza of a classical era piano concerto. And I say classical era because it was encouraged in those days when they were writing it. That's what they did. Those guys were mostly improvisers. It wasn't until the late 19th century and the 20th century where the composer became this kind of figure where it was like the composer was the last word in terms of what was to be played, what notes were to be played, how they were to be played, and this kind of thing. Like you don't change the notes. So that's loosening up again. It's almost like in a weird way we are returning to more of a Baroque era mentality or approach that the performance can be different every time. That this idea of having a definitive performance, oh my God, I mean, Nick, if someone told me I had to perform a Bach suite exactly the same way every time, I would go nuts. I mean, it would just I feel like a robot. It would just be like to go performance after performance of playing it exactly the same way without any deviation. It just, to me, it's not allowing me to fully be an artist in the moment of performance. And I think people are really getting, I think young people are very hip to that right now.
Now, the final question, Jason, is, can you talk about Pat Metheny's 4-movement suite that he's written for you? Did he listen to your Pat Metheny album, and what's your relationship with him? And yeah, just tell me about that work that he's composing.
Yeah, that's been a very wonderful friendship for me, and I feel very blessed to know Pat. And that did start out, that actually happened again through kind of a professional situation, in the sense that his trio and I were playing on the same basically classical music series at the University of Richmond many years ago. This was like 2006 or 2007. And I was doing a concert with the Shanghai String Quartet, great string quartet, and they were in residence at University of Richmond. And we went, there's a lot of, on the road, you play your concert and you go out to dinner, have a couple glasses of wine and you have a nice meal, right? That's a very kind of normal thing. And so we're talking, and the presenter mentioned that she was bringing Pat Metheny in, and I was like, oh my God, I mean, like, one of my very favorite artists, right? So I was like, when is that? And I said, I'm a huge fan. I play a bunch of, I've made a ton of arrangements of his music, which she then, of course, was very intrigued by. I got hired shortly after that to do a solo recital, playing a bunch of those arrangements, right? So, but at the time, I was like, my record company and I, Azika Records, we are thinking of recording an entire record of me playing my solo arrangements of Pat Metheny's music. She said, oh, well, if you can get here to Richmond next October, I'll introduce you to Pat. And which was amazing, because I thought there would be like a whole line of people coming down to see him. But it was just me, and it turned out it was just me and an NPR reporter. And Pat probably asked me more questions than I asked him. I was sort of like, he just immediately walked up to me and asked me about fingernails, because he grows his fingernails for his concerts, because he plays a lot of acoustic guitar and plays a lot of. He often has a solo spot where he does his own arrangements of his own tunes. So he's naturally as a guitarist, he's very curious as to how these classical guys, how they're how they're dealing with their nails from gig to gig. So, I mean, I was kind of standing there dumbfounded because, it was like, as he was walking down the hallway toward me, he was asking the question as he was walking toward me, and I'm like, this is like Paul McCartney was walking toward me, asking me a question, so, at the time. But then, Pat's such a great, wonderful, warm person that it immediately kind of disarms you, like you don't, like you kind of immediately feel like, he's a brother, like a friend and stuff. So that was kind of how it started out. And he's like, oh yeah, I can't, he said, can't wait to hear what you do with the things. And we sent him the first master, and he loved it. And he loved it and wrote, like a little bit of a nice little paragraph for the liner notes. And Steve Rodby, his bass player and co-producer, did as well. And and he told me that Lyle Mays enjoyed it as well, which was great, because those musicians, those guys, I really respect so much as musicians. So, and we, he would just keep in touch. He would ask how things are going and this and that kind of. We just sort of keep in touch, and it just came about that actually. It came about, I can't really get into the details of it right now because it involves a couple other organizations, and so I can't really speak too much about it now, but it just came about that he wanted to write this, he was being asked to write a solo piece, and in the end, he said, well, if I'm going to write a solo piece for guitar, I want to write it for Jason. And so he told me this, and I said, well, that would be great. That would be fine. He had been saying, for years, now that he said, I know there's some kind of project where we're going to work together. I just don't know what it is or when it's going to happen, because Pat is working like 5 projects into the future at all times. Like, I mean, he's just like an artistic machine. I mean, it's incredible the how far into the future he's working all the time. So, which I also learned a lot from about these folks that are working at that level. So yeah, it's been really wonderful. The pieces, I think the piece is a monster. I'm practicing it like 2 to 3 hours a day right now because he's going to record. He's going to be recording me and producing me in February. Like a little over a month, I'm going to be recording this piece, and it's very difficult, and so it requires about 2 to 3 hours of practice a day.
Can't wait to hear it. And Jason, would you, just before you go, would you like to mention any recordings or albums that the listeners should buy that you've just released, or any recent projects? Well,
I've actually, despite the fact that I haven't released a solo CD since Play, I think what a lot of classical guitarists don't know is I've probably been recording more than ever in terms of the actual pace of projects. I mean, I recorded the Gina Stera Sonata a couple of years ago. We've got a lot of things actually coming out on different labels. The Jeff Beal Guitar Concerto just came out on BIS recently. Not just came out, I guess it came out in the fall. And I just recorded the Jonathan Leshnoff Concerto with Nashville Symphony on Naxos. So that's coming out in May. The piece with Pat Metheny is supposed to come out sometime in the spring or early summer. Yeah, because he wants to record that and actually get that turned around, quickly. And my recording with Escher String Quartet, which we recorded 2 years ago. It was basically kind of sitting in the can because I had all these other things coming out with Yolanda and another CD with Yolanda Canonassis, the harpist, and the jazz accordion bandoneon player that I play with, Julian LeBreau. We had another release after Play. So, I mean, there's in the last couple years, there's been a lot of different stuff, and a lot of stuff going to be coming out this year. And also, I know that Anna Kiko Myers, the violinist, wants to do a record project with me. We're playing our first concert tour together this spring, and that's very exciting. So, I mean, it's a lot of very, actually, as I'm sort of talking about it out loud, it's like, gosh, it's a lot. I mean,
it's a lot of stuff.
It's pretty exciting stuff. Yeah.
Well,
I guess that's why I'm back to practicing like 4 or 5 hours a day.
Well, for my audience, please check out Jason's website, jasonvieaux.com. You can get all his recordings there, and you can see his schedule for upcoming dates. Jason, it was such an honor to have you on the show. We'd love to have you again.
Oh
soon.
Yeah, thanks, Nick.
And
I saw your thing. I saw you on Twitter. That's kind of how I got to. So I saw that you've been interviewing a lot of very high profile artists. So it's an honor to be on your show.
I mean, we're so excited to have you on today. So you're definitely in this echelon, and we definitely want to have you back. So Jason, thanks for taking the time, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks. You too, Nick. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.